The church smelled like old hymns and cold judgment. Elanar Wade stood at the altar, her borrowed wedding dress hanging loose on her thin frame, hands trembling around the wilted prairie roses she clutched. She counted the steps. 12. Just 12. To the door. She could run, couldn't she? But the room was packed. Every eye in Copper Ridge was on her, waiting for her answer, hungry for the drama. Clayton Hartwell, the richest rancher in 3 counties, stood across from her, silent and unmoving, like a man hiding storms beneath calm water. His eyes didn't meet hers. His face, chiseled from stone, was set in a hard mask. His hands, rough with years of labor, gripped his weathered hat like it was the only thing holding him together. It would have been easier if he'd been cruel, if he'd shown even a flicker of emotion. But he didn't. He was just there, watching. Unfazed by the storm swirling inside her, the minister droned on, his voice a muffled buzz in the background. Elanar's eyes flickered to the rows of pews, each face a silent witness. Some came with pity, others with judgment, but none of them could understand. Her father wasn't here, too broken by his own failure to bear witness to the bargain he had made. Not a soul in the room knew the weight she carried on her shoulders. Her father had tried to fight, but the bank's demand for payment had left him with no options. Garrett, the stranger with a smooth voice and a smile like silk, had come offering a solution, one Elanar's father couldn't refuse. Marry Clayton Hartwell, and I'll pay off the debt. You'll save your farm, save your family's reputation. But what no one asked was what Elanar wanted. The minister finally spoke her name, pulling her from the dark maze of her thoughts. His voice felt like a blade, cutting through the air. Do you, Elanar Wade, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Her breath caught in her throat, her heart thudded in her chest, drowning out the silence. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking as she whispered, I do. The words barely left her lips before she wished she could take them back, but it was done. The room leaned in, as if the crowd itself could sense her struggle. A murmur ran through the church like distant thunder. She felt their eyes on her, judging, waiting. The minister turned to Clayton, and for a brief moment she prayed he would speak the usual vows, the ones that tied her to him in a formal, predictable way. But Clayton surprised her. His voice was calm, firm, but not cold. I will, he said, his words different from the ritual, the weight of them settling in the space between them. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. A dozen unspoken questions hung in the air, unanswered. The town's eyes burned into her back as she shifted on her feet, the heavy gown dragging at her ankles. They all waited for her to be his, and now she was. By the power vested in the minister, they were man and wife. The minister's voice was final, but it didn't feel real. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Clayton turned toward her then, offering his arm, but she stared at it, as if it might burn her. It was a stranger's arm, now tethered to her future with a single stroke of ink. She could have refused, could have run, but the way the town watched her, the way they held their breath for her reaction, kept her still. Slowly, she placed her hand on his sleeve. His grip was firm but not possessive, like the touch of a man who knew his place, and for the first time, she felt the weight of being bound to him. They walked down the aisle together, through a sea of eyes, all of them watching, all of them judging. Elanar kept her gaze low, her face burning, but the weight of their attention was suffocating. The church doors swung open, and the cold October air bit at her skin. It felt like freedom, but also like a trap. Clayton helped her into the wagon, his movements quiet and careful. His hand brushed against her elbow, and she flinched, instinctively pulling away. He noticed and stepped back without a word, as if offering an apology without speaking it. The horses neighed softly, the sound a reminder of the world outside the walls of the church. "Name's Clayton," he said, breaking the silence as he gathered the reins. "Reckon you know that already." She nodded, her throat tight, but she couldn't find the words to speak. "Are you all right, Miss Wade?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mrs. Hartwell now," she replied, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. She couldn't even bring herself to say the name. Clayton didn't respond right away. He clicked the horses into motion, guiding them out of town, toward the foothills, where the shadows of the mountains began to stretch long in the fading light. They didn't speak, as the town slowly disappeared behind them, its gaze heavy, lingering on her even as the wagon carried them farther away. At the end of the valley, the Hartwell ranch rose against the darkening sky. A timber house with stone foundations, wide porches and windows that caught the last bits of sunlight. Smoke curled from the chimney, warm and inviting, but Elanar felt no warmth, only the chill of what was now her life. Clayton helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful, but she stepped away at once. The gesture was instinctive, a response to the tension that had grown between them in the last hour. "I'll show you inside," Clayton said quietly, his voice low, offering no pressure. The house was large, far larger than anything Elanar had ever known. The front room held a stone fireplace, a handmade rug and polished furniture. The smell of wood, smoke, and coffee lingered in the air. "The kitchen's through there," Clayton said, motioning toward a hallway. "Pantry's full. If you need anything, Silas goes to town Wednesdays." Upstairs, he led her to a room with a four-poster bed, a quilt sewn in blue and cream, and a washstand beside a window that looked toward distant mountains. The door had a lock on the inside, solid brass and gleaming, a small but heavy sign of her captivity. "If you need it," Clayton said, "I won't knock unless you ask me to." She nodded silently. "I understand." Quote. He left her there, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone to settle in a space that wasn't hers, with a man who wasn't a stranger, but might as well have been. She locked the door at once, then sat on the bed, staring at her trembling hands, unsure what to feel next. The morning came gray, the light weak, as though even the sun wasn't sure whether it wanted to rise. Elanar sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty room. The silence around her pressed in like the weight of the earth itself, a reminder of the life she had just agreed to. The biscuits Clayton had left for her were warm enough to soften the edge of her fear, but they did little to calm the storm twisting inside her. She had spent the night locked away in the room they had given her. The silence was suffocating, but it was safer than the alternative. Clayton hadn't come. No knocks, no words. Just the quiet hum of the house settling around her. Her mind, though, refused to quiet. Downstairs, she could hear faint voices, but nothing that felt real. She moved slowly, her feet dragging on the cold wood floor. She found the kitchen easily enough, though everything still felt like a stranger's house, foreign, unsettling. Clayton sat at the kitchen table, a ledger open in front of him, his dark eyes focused on the numbers in front of him. He didn't look up as she entered, but he set the pen down slowly, almost deliberately. "Morning," he said, his voice low, but there was an odd softness in it, as if he wasn't sure what to say either. Elanar didn't answer right away. She walked toward the table and sat across from him. Her hands instinctively reached for the cup of coffee he had already poured for her. The warmth of the cup was a small comfort. The steam from the coffee filled the air between them, mingling with the silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. "Why?" she asked, her voice a little shakier than she intended. "Why did you agree to marry me?" Clayton didn't answer right away. He sat back in his chair, his hands folded on the table, his eyes distant. There was something heavy in his gaze, as if he were seeing something far beyond the room. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and deliberate. "A man named Garrett came to me 6 weeks ago," he said slowly. "He talked about a marriage contract, said it would be good for both sides. Said you were 19, from a decent family that had fallen on hard times." Elanar stared at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She wanted to say something, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she lifted her gaze to meet his. "You said yes," she whispered. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Clayton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I said I would think on it," he replied. "I'm alone here. This house is too big for one man. I thought maybe it was time to have someone else in it, Someone to share the quiet. Elanar absorbed his words, the heavy weight of them pressing down on her chest. There was no cruelty there, no anger, just solitude. She took a shaky breath. "You didn't know I had no choice." Quote. Clayton's expression faltered for the first time since they'd met. He looked down, his hands clenched on the edge of the table. "No," he said quietly, "I didn't know that." The silence between them stretched longer than either of them could bear. Elanar let her words spill out. The anger, the frustration, the sorrow she had kept hidden for too long. She told him about the drought that had ruined their crops for 3 years, how the bank circled like a vulture, how her father had been forced to make a choice that wasn't his to make. She told him about Garrett, the man who had come with an offer that could save them, at a price she had never agreed to pay. Clayton listened in silence, his face unreadable, his hands folded in his lap. When she finished, she sat back, the weight of her confession hanging in the air between them. Clayton let out a slow breath, his gaze softening. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady. "I thought it was mutual, practical. When I saw your face at the altar, I understood. Too late, but I understood." Quote. Elanar watched him carefully, searching for any sign of cruelty or malice, but she found none, only understanding. It was a foreign thing, the way he listened, the way he didn't judge her for the situation she had been forced into. "So you married me anyway," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clayton nodded slowly. "I did, and I meant what I said. I will. I will try every day to make this right. You are my wife, but that doesn't mean I own you." Something inside Elanar loosened, just a little. She didn't know what to make of his words, but they settled somewhere deep in her chest, a small seed of something new. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. A boy stood there, holding an envelope. Clayton took it, his face hardening when he saw the contents. "From the church," the boy said before disappearing down the path. Clayton didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, he tossed it into the fire, his jaw tightening. Elanar watched, a strange pang of curiosity and confusion swirling in her chest. "What was that?" she asked softly. "An invitation," Clayton said, his voice cold. "They want to throw a welcome reception for you on Sunday." Elanar raised an eyebrow. "Do we have to go?" Quote. Clayton shook his head. "We're not going." The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. Elanar didn't say anything else. She simply nodded, trying to process the strange reality of what her life had become. The next few days passed in silence, but not the kind of silence that suffocated. It was the kind of silence that allowed them to coexist without words. They moved around each other like two people who had been thrown into the same space, unsure of how to make it work but willing to try. Clayton rose early every morning, leaving before the sun was fully up. Elanar learned the sound of his boots on the stairs, the way he moved through the house like a shadow. She began to cook, to bake, to fill the house with something more than just the echo of their footsteps. She patched his shirts when the seam split, and though they didn't speak much, the act of caring for him, and for herself, felt like the beginning of something. The house wasn't as cold anymore, the silence wasn't as heavy. And then, one morning, Clayton asked her something unexpected. "You want to learn to ride?" he asked, his voice soft, as if he wasn't sure what her answer would be. Fear tightened in her chest, but she nodded. The thought of riding terrified her, but she couldn't say no. She couldn't stay afraid forever. Clayton brought out a chestnut mare with soft eyes, and he showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit, how to guide the horse without forcing it. His hands brushed hers only when necessary, steady and patient. As the mare shifted beneath her, Elanar laughed, a sound that surprised them both. Clayton smiled, and in that moment, something in his face softened, as if the weight of the world had been lifted just a little. The days that followed seemed to flow differently, more fluid than before, as though the heavy weight of the past few weeks had begun to settle into something less suffocating. The mornings were quiet, each one following the same rhythm. Clayton's boots on the stairs before the sun had fully risen, the sound of the kettle warming on the stove, and Elanar moving through the house with slow, deliberate steps, learning its corners, its sounds, its secrets. Her hands had grown accustomed to the daily chores. she worked through them with a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. She had learned the shape of the kitchen, how the fire in the stove could warm both the air and her spirit, and how the land outside the windows shifted with the seasons. But there was still the town. Copper Ridge. The whispers. They were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. On Wednesday, the day Clayton took Silas to town for supplies, Elanar found herself standing at the edge of the porch, watching the road that stretched toward town. Her thoughts drifted to the other women of Copper Ridge, the ones who had looked at her with judgment, with pity, and the ones who had offered her their silent condemnation. Their voices seemed to echo in her head, their words sharper than the wind that cut through the valley. The townsfolk hadn't stopped talking since the wedding. Elanar had heard snippets, even in the house, women speaking behind closed doors, their voices dropping to a hush when she passed by. Men casting glances over their shoulders when they thought she wasn't looking. She had become a part of the town's gossip, a figure of curiosity, a subject for their judgment. And she couldn't help but feel the weight of it, the eyes that followed her every move. But that morning, as she stood on the porch, watching the horizon, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't just a woman who had been married out of necessity. Not anymore. She was beginning to see herself as someone who could choose, someone who had the power to define her own place in the world. When Clayton returned, he was quieter than usual. His eyes, however, seemed to hold something more than the usual calm. A tension, something unspoken, hovered just beneath the surface. "You want to go to town?" he asked, his voice measured. His tone wasn't the usual calm, but something more. A slight edge that Elanar hadn't heard before. She hesitated, but only for a moment. "I think I do." They rode into town together that afternoon, the town's eyes immediately falling upon them as they passed through the streets. Elanar couldn't help but notice the way the women gathered in tight, whispered clusters. The way their glances darted toward her, then quickly away. But it was the men who caught her attention most. There was something in the way they watched her, a lingering judgment mixed with something else. Something more dangerous. Inside the general store, Mrs. Hawkins was behind the counter, her eyes flicking toward Elanar, but not meeting hers. She weighed flour with practiced hands, her eyes down, avoiding any real contact. Elanar stood in line, her stomach tightening with each passing moment. The air felt thick with tension, the walls of the store suddenly too small, too close. She could hear the whispers, the soft murmurs that followed them like a shadow. "Everything all right?" Clayton's voice broke through her thoughts, his calm presence like a quiet reassurance. She nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. As they made their way to the door, a drunk cowboy leaning against the post outside sneered at them, his eyes lingering on Elanar. He grinned, then made a show of stretching out his arms. "Well now," he said, his voice slurred with drink. "How's married life, Mrs. Hartwell? That old rancher treat you gentle?" The words struck her like a slap, sharp and humiliating. Her face burned with the sting of his insinuation, but before she could respond, Clayton stepped forward. His shadow seemed to swallow the sun, and his voice, low and firm, cut through the air. "You got something to say. You say it to me," he said, his tone like a threat wrapped in calm. The cowboy hesitated, his bravado fading as he looked up at Clayton's towering figure. He quickly averted his gaze, muttering something about not meaning any harm. "Then say nothing," Clayton said coldly, turning his back on the man. Elanar stood there, her heart still racing, her breath shallow. The tension in the air seemed to press on her chest, but it wasn't just the cowboy's words that bothered her. It was the way Clayton had stepped in, the way he had protected her, and the way she hadn't expected it. When they got back to the wagon, she stared at her hands, still feeling the burn of the man's words, but more than that, the echo of Clayton's calm authority. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "For what?" Clayton asked, his voice soft, like he truly didn't understand. "For how they look at you now," she said quietly. "For the gossip, the way they talk about us." Clayton was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then he spoke, his voice low but steady. "They can look all they want," he said, his tone unshaken. "What matters is you're here. You're safe." Quote. The words settled over Elanar like a blanket, warm and comforting. She didn't know what to make of them, but something in the way he said it, in the way he spoke without hesitation, made her believe him. That evening, after they had returned to the ranch, Elanar found Clayton in the yard. He was bent over, his hands moving through the soil as he planted bulbs. She watched him for a moment, noticing the steady way his hands worked, as if the earth itself was a thing he could control, shape, and grow. "What are those?" she asked softly, stepping closer. "Tulips," he said, glancing up at her. "For spring." Elanar smiled. The idea of something growing, something blooming, felt strangely comforting. "You think you'll still be here come spring?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. She thought about it for a moment, looking out across the land. She didn't have all the answers, but there was something solid, something real in the ground beneath her feet. Something that wasn't just the weight of a contract or the expectations of others. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I think I will." Clayton nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips, though it was fleeting. There was a moment of quiet between them, the kind of quiet that wasn't heavy anymore. Just a shared understanding that they were, in some way, beginning to build something together. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and Elanar felt something shift inside her. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. It was trust. It was the beginning of something new. The next morning came with a bite in the air. The first light of day had barely touched the earth, yet Elanar was already awake, lying in bed with a thin quilt pulled tight over her shoulders. The house was still quiet. Clayton was gone, no boots on the stairs this time. She wondered if he had risen even before the sun, like he often did, or if he had simply slipped out without her noticing. She sat up slowly, the chill in the room curling around her, and glanced out the window. The frost that had settled on the edges of the panes caught the light, the earth still holding onto the remnants of winter. Her breath misted in the cold air as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Her fingers brushed the lock on the door. It had become a silent companion, one that had kept her safe in the nights that felt too long, too heavy. But now, for the first time in days, she didn't feel quite as afraid. Her heart still carried the weight of the choices she'd made, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. Downstairs, the house was still. The smell of the fire in the hearth hung faintly in the air, and there was the soft scent of fresh bread. The faintest sound of the wind outside was the only interruption. Elanar moved through the kitchen, preparing the morning meal. The rhythm of it, the familiarity of cooking, felt like something she could hold on to. The simple, repetitive tasks brought her comfort. Kneading the dough, setting the table, even the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, it was all small, but it was hers. When Clayton finally came home, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, Elanar was just finishing the bread. He had a faraway look in his eyes, his face weathered from the early morning ride. He paused at the doorframe and looked at her. "Morning," he said quietly. Elanar nodded, offering him a small, careful smile. "Morning." The air between them was still fragile, though the silence was no longer full of tension. There was something growing, like roots pushing through the earth, working their way toward the light. Neither of them spoke for a while, simply moving around each other in the kitchen, the kind of quiet that felt comfortable. Finally, Clayton broke the silence. "You want to come with me today?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. There was something tentative in his words, an invitation rather than an order. "To town?" Elanar asked, her brows furrowing. He nodded. "Thought we might stop by the post office, get a few things." Quote, it wasn't just the trip to town that made her pause, but the offer itself. The idea of Clayton asking her to come, of him wanting her by his side, felt like another shift, one that made her chest tighten with a strange sort of anticipation. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come." They rode out of the yard together, the wagon rattling down the path toward town. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the land. It was still early enough that the town was quiet, the streets empty except for a few early risers, the shopkeepers, the ones who had to open the stores before the rest of the town stirred. When they reached Copper Ridge, the familiar sight seemed different to Elanar, though she couldn't quite place why. It was the same town she had always known, yet it felt foreign now, the eyes that had followed her on her last trip to town now feeling more like distant memories. They passed the general store where Mrs. Hawkins had avoided her gaze, but today the woman simply nodded at them as they passed. Her shoulders were a little straighter, her smile a little warmer. Elanar couldn't tell if it was because of Clayton's presence or if the town itself was beginning to shift. Maybe it was both. They made their way to the post office, and when they stepped inside, the air felt charged. The small room was dimly lit, with a wood counter lined with shelves, stacked high with letters and packages. The postmaster looked up as they entered, his eyes meeting Elanar's for the first time without a hint of judgment in them. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, a polite but genuine tone in his voice. Elanar froze for a moment, caught off guard by the civility. "Morning," she replied, surprised by how easy it felt to say it. Clayton stood by the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression neutral. But there was something in the way the postmaster looked at him that told Elanar things were changing, even if only in small ways. They finished their business at the post office quickly, and as they stepped back out into the cold air, Clayton turned to her. "You want to grab something from the store while we're here?" he asked. Elanar nodded, though her stomach tightened again. She had no idea how the town would treat her now. She had no idea how she would handle it. But Clayton's calm presence beside her made it feel like she could face whatever was coming. They made their way to the store, and it wasn't long before Elanar realized that the whispers had not stopped. This time, though, they weren't as harsh. They weren't the same pointed stares from before. The town was watching, but the judgment wasn't as loud. It was quieter now, more cautious. Inside the store, Mrs. Hawkins greeted them with more warmth than Elanar had expected, offering a small smile before turning to fill their order. Outside, a group of men stood on the porch, their eyes following her every step. Elanar kept her gaze forward, walking beside Clayton as if she didn't feel the weight of their stares. And when they reached the wagon, the cowboy who had made the crude remark last time wasn't there. It felt like a small victory. But the real change came when they left the store. Elanar caught sight of Mrs. Dalton standing by the window of her shop, her expression no longer sharp. She didn't smile, but the way she looked at Elanar had softened. It wasn't a grand change, but it was enough. As they rode back toward the ranch, Elanar couldn't help but feel something different in her chest, something lighter. "I think the town's starting to change," she said quietly, looking up at Clayton. He glanced over at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, after a beat, he nodded. "It's a start," he said softly, "but we've still got a long way to go." The words hung between them, but they didn't feel heavy. For the first time since their wedding, Elanar didn't feel like the weight of the world was pressing on her shoulders. It felt like something was beginning to shift, like the earth beneath her feet was starting to settle into something more solid. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to stay. The mornings were quieter now, the sound of Clayton's boots on the stairs, a familiar rhythm in Elanar's life. It was a rhythm she had come to depend on, one that settled the restlessness in her chest. She didn't know if it was the quiet of the house or the rhythm of their shared life that soothed her, but something inside her was starting to find peace. They had found a sort of rhythm together, even without words. He still left before dawn, but there was a sense of steadiness in the way they moved around each other. The house had started to feel less like a prison and more like a home. There were moments of stillness, but in those moments she didn't feel quite as lonely. Clayton never pushed. He never expected anything from her that she wasn't ready to give. His quiet patience, his careful respect for her boundaries, slowly built something between them that Elanar hadn't expected: trust. It had been nearly a month since their wedding, and the time had passed in strange, unpredictable waves. There were still moments of tension, but the quiet had started to ease the discomfort. She had learned to live with it, even started to look forward to it. There were times when she found herself making the fire a little brighter, or when she'd set the table just a little more carefully. She was still learning what it meant to be his wife, but something inside her had begun to change. The fear that had gripped her on that wedding day, the fear that had nearly swallowed her whole, was starting to fade. Not completely, but enough to make room for something else. It was late one afternoon when Elanar found herself standing at the edge of the yard, her hands deep in the soil as she planted more bulbs. The cold wind had started to bite again, but the sun still hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Clayton had gone into town, leaving her alone with the house and the land, and for the first time in a while, Elanar found herself thinking about what she wanted. Not what the town wanted, not what her father wanted, but what she wanted. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. She turned toward the road, squinting against the fading light. It was Clayton, returning from town, his figure outlined against the horizon. He was riding Clementine, the chestnut mare she had grown accustomed to, with a package tied behind the saddle. As he rode closer, Elanar felt a strange flutter of anticipation in her chest. She didn't know why, but the sight of him, returning, with something in hand, made her heart beat just a little faster. Clayton pulled the horse to a stop in front of her, dismounting gracefully, his movements easy and practiced. "Afternoon," he said, his voice quiet as he reached for the package. "Afternoon," Elanar replied, brushing her hands on her skirts and stepping toward him. He handed her the package, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. There was something in them, something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't exactly a smile, but there was warmth there, something that felt like recognition. She took the package, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, but the shape was unmistakable. A book. She hadn't seen one in years, not since before the drought, before everything had changed. "What's this?" she asked, looking up at him, her voice a little uncertain. "I thought you might like something to read," Clayton said, his voice almost hesitant. "It's not much, but it's something." Elanar turned the package over in her hands, her fingers brushing over the rough paper. She was about to speak when something in her chest tightened, and she suddenly found herself fighting back the tears that had no reason to be there. She hadn't realized how much she had missed books, how much she had missed the simple pleasure of losing herself in a story. It felt like a kindness she hadn't expected. A kindness she hadn't known she needed. She didn't know what to say, so instead, she simply tore off the paper, revealing a leather-bound book. It was a novel, old and worn, but the cover was still sturdy, still strong. "Clayton?" she whispered, her voice catching. "Thank you." He nodded, his expression still soft. "You deserve something for yourself," he said quietly. "Something that's just yours." Elanar's heart squeezed, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. It wasn't just the book that mattered, though it was a kindness. It was the fact that he saw her in a way no one else had in years. He didn't see her as the woman who had been forced into marriage, didn't see her as someone who had nothing. He saw her as someone who could choose, who could be her own person, even in the middle of the life they had built together. She swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I'll treasure it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Clayton's eyes softened, and for the first time there was no distance between them, just the quiet understanding of two people who had been through the fire and had come out on the other side, scarred but still standing. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the night settled over the ranch, Elanar curled up in a chair by the window, the book resting on her lap. The wind howled outside, but inside it was warm. Inside there was peace. Clayton sat at the table, the soft sound of his pen scratching against paper breaking the silence. For the first time, Elanar didn't feel like an outsider in her own home. She didn't feel like someone who had been forced into a life she didn't choose. She felt like someone who had a place here, someone who mattered. The quiet between them wasn't oppressive anymore. It wasn't cold. It was simply theirs. The days continued to pass, the seasons turning as they always did. It was still early spring when Elanar found herself standing on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The tulips she had planted were beginning to bloom, the bright colors standing out against the thawing earth. And in the distance she could see Clayton working in the fields, his figure outlined against the setting sun. Her heart swelled in her chest, a quiet certainty settling in her bones. This was her life now. This was her choice. "I choose this," she whispered to the wind, and for the first time she knew she was telling the truth. The days had begun to feel less like survival and more like living. Elanar's hands no longer trembled when she worked, her movements more confident as the seasons changed. The land around the ranch, once barren and cold, began to breathe again, the spring air filling the earth with promise. She found herself waking with the sun, the early morning light casting long shadows across the yard, as she moved through her chores with a sense of purpose that had once seemed impossible. Clayton had grown quieter in the past few weeks. He still left early, returning with the same steady determination he always had. But there was something in the way he looked at her now, a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She had caught him watching her from time to time, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something more than just the woman standing in front of him. It made her wonder what thoughts lived behind his silence. The ranch had become their shared space, neither hers nor his, but theirs. The boundaries between them had started to blur, and she found herself looking toward the future, uncertain, but with a flicker of hope she hadn't expected. It was one late evening, after dinner, when the stillness of the night seemed to hold its breath, that Clayton spoke. They had finished their meal in silence, but tonight, the quiet between them felt different, deeper. "Tomorrow," he said, breaking the silence, "I'm going into town for the day. Need to meet with the mayor. Thought you might want to come." Elanar paused, her fork still in her hand. She hadn't expected him to ask her, hadn't realized how much she had begun to crave the normalcy of the town again, the feeling of belonging. "Of course," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "I think I'd like that." The next morning, they rode into town together. Elanar had noticed the subtle shift in the way the townsfolk regarded them. They still looked, but the whispers were different now. The judgment was quieter. She could feel it. The shift in perception. At the post office, the postmaster greeted them by name, and Mrs. Hawkins, who had once given Elanar nothing but cold glances, smiled as they entered the store. It was small changes, but they were changes nonetheless. The town was beginning to see them not as an oddity, not as an arrangement, but as two people who had made a life of their own choosing. As they passed through the town square, Elanar saw familiar faces, and for the first time, they didn't feel like strangers. She smiled at them, and they smiled back. It was a quiet sort of victory, but one that she'd come to cherish. The town had accepted them, and more importantly, they had accepted each other. Later, after Clayton had finished his business, they walked through the square again, side by side. Elanar felt a strange, new sense of belonging settle in her chest, as if the weight of the past was finally lifting. The world seemed just a little lighter. "Thank you," she said, glancing at Clayton, her voice soft, "for everything." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, but the way he touched her arm made her heart flutter. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I did it because I wanted to, because I chose you." Her heart skipped a beat, the words sinking deep into her chest, a weight that was both comforting and beautiful. They were silent for a moment, just walking together through the town. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with anything other than the quiet of the evening and the steady beat of their footsteps. As they reached the edge of town, heading back toward the ranch, Clayton stopped for a moment, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Elanar followed his gaze, but all she saw was the expanse of land that stretched before them, the rolling hills, the wide open sky. "I'll never be able to undo the past," Clayton said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can choose to build something with you now, something better." Elanar turned toward him, her heart heavy, with a tenderness she couldn't quite explain. "And we'll do it together," she said, her voice steady and sure. He nodded, and for the first time there was no hesitation in his gaze. It wasn't just the words he spoke, it was the way he said them. with absolute certainty. The ranch felt different that evening when they returned. The house, once cold and empty, now felt full of life. The sound of the wind outside no longer seemed oppressive, but a part of the world they had come to inhabit. They were no longer strangers to each other, no longer people bound by circumstance. They had built something together, step by step, and it was something they both could be proud of. That night, as Elanar sat by the fire, reading the book Clayton had given her, she realized that she no longer felt trapped. She didn't feel like a woman who had been forced into a marriage. She felt like a woman who had chosen a new life, a life built on trust and respect, a life where she could stand beside the man she had come to care for, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them both. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was home. Spring had come in full bloom, and with it, Elanar's heart. The tulips she had planted were in full bloom, their colors vibrant against the thawing earth, and Clayton stood beside her, watching them with quiet approval. "They took their time," he said with a smile, "but they made it." Elanar smiled, her eyes soft as she looked at the flowers. "Sometimes things take time," she said, her voice steady, "but when they bloom, they're worth it." Clayton's hand found hers, his grip gentle but sure, and together they watched the world outside change, knowing they had created something that would last. "Let's see where this goes," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had built. "I'm ready," Elanar whispered. And with that, the quiet peace of the ranch, of their life together, settled in, and for the first time, they both knew this was only the beginning.